The cold came early that year. It didn't creep in the way it sometimes did. That slow, polite chill that gave you a week to stack your firewood and seal your window frames with rags. No. That December it arrived overnight, like something that had been waiting just beyond the ridge and finally lost its patience. By the first Monday of the month, the ground was iron hard, and the creek behind the schoolhouse had gone quiet under 2 inches of ice. Selene Ashford had been awake since before 4. She had learned somewhere in her third or fourth winter in Red Hollow that the schoolhouse took a full 2 hours to warm properly. The iron stove in the corner was old and temperamental. Good days it heated the room like a generous neighbor. Bad days it smoked and sulked and barely took the edge off the freeze. You had to start early. You had to be patient. You had to know its moods. She had gotten good at knowing the moods of things that couldn't speak. She knelt beside the stove now, coaxing the flame from a nest of dry kindling, her breath making small clouds in the dark air of the room. Her fingers were already stiff. She had gloves somewhere. She always had gloves somewhere. But mornings like this she moved by feel and habit, and the gloves never seemed important until the cold had already settled into her knuckles. The match caught on the third strike. She held it to the kindling and watched the flame take hold, small and trembling at first, then steadier. She sat back on her heels and let out a breath. There was something about those first few minutes of morning, before the children arrived, before the town stirred, before anyone needed anything from her, that felt like the only time the day truly belonged to her. She didn't do much with that time. She just existed in it. Drank her coffee, standing at the window, watching the sky over the mountains shift from black to a deep, bruised blue. That morning, the first thing she saw was the Mercer wagon. It moved slowly along the road that ran past the eastern edge of the schoolyard, a dark shape against the snow, the horse's breath rising in white plumes. Elias Mercer drove the way he did everything, straight-backed, deliberate, not particularly fast. She couldn't see his face at that distance, but she knew the set of his shoulders, knew the particular stillness of a man who had decided not to feel things in public. She watched until the wagon disappeared behind the tree line, then turned back to her classroom. She had 31 students that year, ages 6 to 14, spread across 4 long benches, sharing textbooks that were 2 editions behind what the schools in the cities were using. 3 of those 31 were Mercer children, or had been, 2 years ago. Now there were only 2. Clara, 12, quiet and careful with her words, the kind of child who listened to everything and volunteered nothing. And Noah, 8, who cried easily and tried very hard to hide it, which made him cry more often than children who didn't try at all. Their older sister, Margaret, had left for school in Helena the previous fall, something Selene gathered from Clara's brief flat announcement, "Maggie's gone to the city school now," delivered in the same tone someone might use to report the weather. The Mercer children sat in the second row, always together, always slightly apart from the other children, in a way that wasn't unfriendly, exactly. More like they had an invisible edge around them that the other children had learned to respect without being told to. Selene understood that edge. She had one too. She just wore it differently. That morning, Clara arrived first. She usually did, stomping the snow off her boots at the door with a thoroughness that suggested she'd been told about mud on floors more than once. She was wearing the same gray coat she'd worn all November. The hem was a little short. Her wrist showed below the sleeves. "Morning, Miss Ashford." "Morning, Clara. Cold enough for you?" Clara considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. "Colder than last week," she said. "Pa says the creek behind the south pasture froze clean through. That doesn't usually happen until January." "Your father's probably right." "He usually is. About the weather, anyway." She paused, as if she'd said something she hadn't quite meant to, then went to her seat. Noah came in 3 minutes later with a red nose and a missing button on his coat. He didn't say good morning. He dropped into his seat, pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, and studied it with great concentration until Selene pretended not to be looking at him. She didn't ask about the paper. She had learned that too, when to ask and when to leave a child alone in whatever small private thing was keeping them steady. The day went the way most days went. Arithmetic, reading, a fierce and eventually tearful disagreement between 2 of the older boys about whether the Missouri River or the Mississippi was longer, which Selene resolved by producing the atlas and making both boys read the relevant entry aloud, which satisfied no one but stopped the argument. Noon break, during which the children ate whatever they'd brought from home, and Selene ate half a biscuit and drank the rest of her cold coffee from the morning and tried to write 3 letters she'd been meaning to write for 2 weeks. She managed half of one letter before the bell rang and she put it away. After school, once the last child had left, she stayed to mark the reading exercises from the younger students. It was slow work. She sat at her desk with the afternoon light coming through the west window, the fire burning down behind her, and went through the pages one by one. Correcting without crushing. That was the aim. Showing a child that they'd gotten something wrong without making them feel stupid for having tried it. It took her an hour. By the time she finished, the light had changed to the flat gray of late afternoon and the room had cooled noticeably despite the stove. She stacked the papers, capped her ink, put on her coat. Then she did what she did every evening. Walked home through the snow to her rented rooms above the dry goods store, went up the outside stairs that were always slightly icy, unlocked her door, and stood for a moment in the dim, cold interior before lighting her lamp. 2 rooms. A narrow bed, a washstand, a kitchen table with 2 chairs she had never needed both of. A bookshelf she'd built herself from planks and bricks, which leaned slightly to the left but held. On the windowsill, a small pine bough she'd cut and set in a jar of water 2 weeks ago, trying to bring something of Christmas into the room. It had mostly dried out. The needles were going brittle. She looked at it for a moment, then looked away. She had come to Red Hollow from a small town in Poland, though she rarely talked about that to anyone. Not because she was ashamed, she wasn't particularly, but because it required a longer explanation than most conversations seemed to have room for. Her father had died when she was 15. Her mother had followed within the year, which Selene had always believed was less about illness and more about will, or the absence of it in the end. She had an uncle in Chicago who had written twice and then stopped writing, and a cousin somewhere in Pennsylvania she'd met once when she was 7 and remembered only as a girl with very red hair who smelled like cloves. She trained as a teacher in Chicago because it was one of the things women could do that was also respectable and occasionally useful, and she was good at it in the practical, unspectacular way that didn't make anyone write newspaper articles but kept 31 children from growing up entirely ignorant. Red Hollow had needed a teacher. She had needed somewhere to be needed. 7 years later, here she was. There were people in town who considered her a friend. Helen Marsh at the post office, who always saved her the newspapers and asked after her health with genuine interest. Reverend Cook, who was about 70 and mostly deaf, and called her the Polish girl, in a way that somehow wasn't unkind. Dora Finch, the seamstress 2 doors down from the dry goods store, who occasionally knocked on Selene's door in the evenings to show her some bit of needlework she was proud of. These were good people. She was glad to know them. But there was a difference, one she had long since stopped trying to explain even to herself, between being liked by a town and belonging to one, between being the person everyone was happy to see and being the person someone was waiting for. She had never been the person someone was waiting for. She cooked herself a small supper, beans, salt pork, a heel of bread, and ate it at her kitchen table reading the newspaper from 4 days ago, because 4 days old was the freshest she could usually get. She washed her plate. She grated 2 more papers she'd brought home in her bag. She sat by the window for a while with a book she couldn't quite concentrate on, watching the snow come down in the lamplight, steady and indifferent. By 8 o'clock, the street below was empty. Every window in Red Hollow was warm except hers. She put out the lamp and went to bed. Wow. The invitation came on Thursday. She was standing in the post office, collecting a package of replacement textbooks from the school board office in Helena. They were 2 years late and 2 editions behind what she'd requested, but she thanked Helen Marsh for them anyway. When the door opened and Elias Mercer walked in, she had spoken to him, over 7 years, perhaps 40 times, maybe fewer. He came to pick up his children at the end of the school year, exchanged brief acknowledgments when they crossed paths in town, and once, 3 years ago, had spent 4 minutes talking to her about Noah's difficulty with fractions, in a conversation that was direct and practical and finished cleanly the way Elias Mercer seemed to prefer all his conversations to finish. I was not a man who wasted words. She respected that mostly. He was also not a man who smiled easily, which she understood because some people stop smiling after something and then the mechanism becomes unfamiliar, like a door hinge that's rusted over. You don't lock the door because you want to. You lock it because it became the natural position and changing it requires effort you haven't found a reason to make yet. He came to the counter, nodded at Helen, nodded at Selene. Miss Ashford. Mr. Mercer. He collected his mail. 3 envelopes and a newspaper, and stood there for a moment with them in his hand, which was unusual. Elias Mercer did not usually stand and consider things in public. "I wanted to speak with you," he said finally. "If you have a moment." Helen Marsh developed a sudden and urgent interest in a stack of parcels at the far end of the counter. "Of course," Selene said. He looked at the envelopes in his hand, then at her. His jaw moved slightly, like he was choosing between two versions of what he was about to say. "Christmas is next week," he said. "It is. The children—" He stopped, started again. "Clara and Noah. They've been—" Another pause. He seemed genuinely uncomfortable, which was strange on a man who usually projected the mild, impersonal confidence of someone who had been making large decisions alone for years. "They've talked about you, Miss Ashford, more than most things." She waited. "I know you typically spend the holiday alone," he said. "Don't take offense at that. It's just, I know you don't have family nearby, and I thought—" He stopped a third time, and she watched him arrive, through what appeared to be genuine internal effort, at the direct version. "I'd like you to spend Christmas at the ranch, with the children, with us, if you're willing." She didn't answer immediately. It wasn't that she was weighing the offer the way you'd weigh a business proposition. It was that no one had offered her something like this in a long time, and she'd learned, after enough disappointments, to be careful about yes when it came to things she actually wanted. "Why?" she asked. He looked mildly surprised, as if he'd expected either a yes or a no, and hadn't prepared for a question. "Because I think it would be good for them," he said. Then, after a moment, "And I think it would be good for you." "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "I don't need charity." "It's not charity." His voice didn't rise, but something in it sharpened. "I don't offer charity, Miss Ashford. I'm asking you to Christmas dinner. There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment. He held her gaze steadily, the way a man looks at something he's already decided about. "All right," she said. He nodded once, as if the matter was settled. "Christmas Eve. I'll send the wagon at midday." He left. Helen Marsh reappeared from behind her parcels and said nothing at all, which, from Helen, was the loudest possible comment. The drive out to Mercer Ranch took 40 minutes through countryside, that in summer was probably beautiful, and in December was the particular bleak splendor of Montana winter. White fields going back to white mountains, the sky a low, pale gray, the road a pair of wheel ruts in the snow. The man Elias had sent, a ranch hand named Garrett, 18 or 19, with a scruff of beard he was clearly working hard on, made one attempt at conversation about the weather, and, when she didn't take it much further, spent the rest of the ride in comfortable silence, which she appreciated. She had brought things. She hadn't planned to bring things. She had told herself she would simply come, eat dinner, be pleasant, and return. But the night before, she had found herself at her kitchen table with a half-finished paper chain and the pine bough she'd meant to throw away, and a tin of butter cookies she'd been saving for some unspecified future occasion, and she had thought, "I'm going to someone else's house for Christmas. I should bring something." She also brought her copy of A Christmas Carol, which she'd read aloud to students every December for 6 years and knew almost by heart. She wasn't sure why she brought it. It just seemed like the kind of thing that belonged in a house with children at Christmas. The ranch appeared as they came over a low rise. A main house, 2 barns, a collection of outbuildings arranged with the practical efficiency of a place that had been built for work rather than appearance. There were lights in the windows, smoke from 2 chimneys. Clara was on the porch before the wagon fully stopped, which was the first indication that the children had been watching for her. She descended the steps carefully on icy wood and came around to the side of the wagon. "You came," she said. "I said I would." "I know. I wasn't sure—" Clara stopped, pressed her lips together. "I'm glad you came." Noah appeared in the doorway. He was wearing what was clearly his good shirt, buttoned all the way up, and he had made some effort with his hair that had not entirely succeeded. "Miss Ashford!" He said it with the volume of someone who had been waiting to say it. "Pa said you might come. I told him you would." "You were right," she said, and his face did the thing that 8-year-old faces do when something they hoped for actually happens. The pure, uncomplicated relief of it. She stepped down from the wagon. The porch boards were solid under her feet. The front door, half open, released a breath of warm air that carried something cooking. Something with cinnamon, she thought, and the deeper yeasty smell of bread. Ilias appeared in his doorway behind Noah. He'd changed out of his ranch clothes into a dark vest and clean shirt, which she noticed, and then made a point not to notice. "Miss Ashford," he said, "you made it." "Garrett drives well," she said. "He does." He stepped aside. "Come in." She stepped through the door. The house was not what she had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she'd expected. It was larger than it looked from outside. A wide main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen visible through an arch on the right, a staircase along the far wall. The furniture was plain and functional and clearly old. There were gaps in the room, empty spaces on the mantel, a bare section of wall that might have once held something, that she noticed but didn't look at too long. A woman she didn't recognize came out of the kitchen drying her hands on her apron. 60s, stout, with a face that had spent a lot of years outdoors, and a look about her that suggested she formed opinions quickly and revised them slowly. "This is Mrs. Dolan," Elias said. "She's managed the house for some years now." Mrs. Dolan looked Selene over with the directness of someone who had earned the right to form opinions of people in this house. "You're the school teacher," she said. "I am." "Noah says you're the best teacher in Montana." "Noah's 8, Selene said. His sample size is limited." Mrs. Dolan's mouth compressed briefly at the corners. Not quite a smile, but close. "Come in then," she said. "I'll get tea." The afternoon moved in the particular slow, slightly uncertain way of hours spent with people you don't quite know yet. She helped Clara set the table, a process during which Clara talked more than Selene had heard her talk in 7 years of school, about the ranch, about the horses, about a recipe their mother had made for Christmas that no one had been able to replicate exactly since, and that Mrs. Dolan had been attempting again that morning. "She says the secret is more butter," Clara said, laying forks with the careful exactness of someone who needed things to be right. "But I don't think that's it. I think it's something else, something Ma did different." "Sometimes it's in the technique," Selene said. "The how, not just the what." Clara looked at her over the table. "That's what Pa says about the horses. Your father's right about a lot of things." Clara considered this, then, "Not everything." It was the same tone she'd used that first morning, careful, like she'd said something she hadn't entirely planned, and was watching to see what Selene would do with it. Selene folded a napkin and said nothing. In the kitchen, she helped Mrs. Dolan with the bread, which involved a conversation that was mostly Mrs. Dolan asking questions in the matter-of-fact way of someone who wanted information and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. How long had she been in Montana? Where was she from before? Did she have people somewhere? "Poland," Selene said. "And no, not anymore." Mrs. Dolan turned this over, kneaded the dough twice, and said, "Mr. Mercer's the same, came out here from Ohio with his wife. She had people in Helena, but they're mostly gone now. He's been on his own with those children 3 years." "I know," Selene said. "Then you know he doesn't ask for much." Selene looked at her. "I mean," Mrs. Dolan said, returning to her dough, "that he doesn't make a habit of inviting people." "He made an exception." "He did," Mrs. Dolan agreed. She didn't say anything else, which was, Selene was beginning to understand, its own kind of comment. Supper was better than she had expected. The food was good. The roast, the bread, the attempted Christmas cake that tasted slightly different from whatever memory it was trying to reach, but was, on its own terms, genuinely fine. They sat at the table, the 4 of them plus Mrs. Dolan, who ate in the kitchen by preference and habit, and for the first hour it was a little stiff, the way meals are with people who don't yet know each other's rhythms. Noah talked constantly, which helped. He had the gift of filling silence without it feeling like an imposition, something she'd noticed in school, too, how he could be present in a room without making it smaller. He told her about the barn cat, who'd had kittens in October and then moved them somewhere no one could find. He told her about a tree in the south field that had been struck by lightning in September, and had a burn mark on it shaped, according to Noah, like a rabbit. "It doesn't look like the rabbit," Clara said. "It does if you look at it right." "That's what you say about everything." "Because everything looks like something if you look at it right." Elias said very little. He ate. He refilled her water glass once without being asked, which she noted. He answered Noah's questions with the brief competence of a man who had learned how to be a parent, mostly by trying not to fail at it. He watched Clara, sometimes, when he thought no one was looking. A particular expression on his face that was neither sad nor happy, but had both underneath it, the way certain colors exist on the spectrum between 2 other colors. After supper, she took out A Christmas Carol. She had meant to offer it as something for the children, casually, in case they wanted it. Instead, somehow, she ended up on the settee near the fire with Noah crowded against her left side and Clara sitting just slightly too far away on the other end, and Elias in the chair across the room with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, and she read. She read well. She knew she read well. It was one of the things she did without modesty because children needed it. Needed to hear a story told with full commitment, without apology, without the self-consciousness that made adults flatten the voices and rush the dramatic parts. She gave Scrooge his proper bitterness. She made the ghost of Christmas past sound like something half-remembered. When she got to the Cratchit family, the simple warmth of that table, the thin soup and the fierce love and the toast to Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast, said Mrs. Cratchit with an irony not unmarked by others. She heard, without looking up, a small sound from Noah. She kept reading. She read for an hour and 20 minutes. By the end, Noah was asleep against her arm, and Clara had, incrementally, migrated to the center of the settee. And Elias, across the room, was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a name for and didn't try to find one for right then. She closed the book. Clara stood up quietly, the way children do when they're trying to prove they're older than they feel. "I'll take him up," she said, and she gathered her brother with practiced care and walked him, half asleep and compliant, toward the stairs. The room was very quiet after they left. The fire had burned down to good coals. Outside, the snow was still coming down. She could hear the particular silence of a heavy snowfall, that muffled quality, as if the world had pulled something soft and dense over itself. "He'll sleep through the night now," she said, because someone needed to say something. "He usually doesn't," Elias said. "He has nights that are hard." She looked at him. "He doesn't like dark rooms," Elias said. "Since—" He stopped. "A while now." She thought of Noah's folded paper, pulled from his pocket that first cold morning. The careful, studious look he'd given it, like it was keeping him in his seat. "Does he know you know?" she asked. "No. It might help if he did." Elias looked at the fire. "Maybe," he said. It was not an agreement. It was not a refusal either. It was the sound of a man who knew he was probably wrong about something and wasn't ready to be right about it yet. She gathered her coat and her book. The tin of cookies had been eaten, mostly by Noah and enthusiastically. Her pine bough she'd left at home. This house had enough pine. Mrs. Dolan had hung garland along the mantel, simple and a little sparse, but present. "I'll walk you to the door," Elias said. "It's 5 feet away." Nevertheless, they stood at the door. Outside, Garrett had brought the wagon around. She could see the horse's breath in the lamplight from the barn. "Thank you," she said, "for the invitation." "Thank you for coming," he said. Then, "The children—" He paused. Looked at her with the same directness he'd used in the post office. "You're good with them." "They're good children," she said. "They are," he agreed. Something moved in his face, a small muscle, near the jaw, the kind of involuntary thing that happens when someone is holding something carefully. "You could come back," he said, "tomorrow, if you wanted to." She looked at him. "The weather might keep you anyway," he said. "The pass road will be difficult." "Is that the reason you're giving?" He almost smiled. "Almost." "It's a reason," he said. She looked past him into the warm room, the dying fire, the chair where he'd sat, the settee where his children had fallen asleep against her like she was something safe. She had spent 7 years building warmth in rooms that belonged to other people. "I'll think about it," she said. She meant yes. He probably knew she meant yes. But sometimes the distance between knowing something and saying it out loud is the whole point, and they were both people who understood the value of crossing that distance carefully. She went out into the snow. The wagon was warm enough, with the blanket Garrett handed her without comment. The road back to Red Hollow was silver-white under a sky that had finally cleared, stars pressing through behind the last of the snow clouds. She sat with the empty cookie tin in her lap, and her worn copy of Dickens pressed against her side, and watched the dark shape of Mercer Ranch recede behind her in the cold and the quiet. Inside those windows, for a few hours tonight, she had not been performing warmth for other people. She had just been warm. That was new enough that she didn't quite have a word for it. She held on to it the whole way home. She went back the next day. She told herself it was because of the road conditions, which were genuinely bad. A fresh 4 inches had fallen overnight, and the pass road that connected the eastern side of town to the outlying ranches was the kind of surface that made sensible people stay where they were. She told herself it was because she'd left her good scarf on the peg by the Mercer door, which was true, though she didn't realize it until she was already halfway there, and the cold on her neck confirmed it. She did not tell herself that she had lain awake until well past midnight, thinking about the particular quality of warmth in that room, the way Noah's weight had felt against her arm, the way Clara had moved, inch by inch, across the settee without acknowledging she was doing it, the way Elias Mercer had stood at the door with the cold at his back and said you could come back like the words had cost him something. Garrett met her at the road with the horse, which meant Elias had sent him, which meant Elias had expected her. She found she didn't mind being expected. It was different from being taken for granted. She was still working out exactly how, but the difference was there. The ranch in daylight was different from the ranch the night before. More real, somehow. Less like something seen through firelight, and more like a working place with its practical imperfections plainly visible. A fence post leaning at the wrong angle. Mud at the barn door despite the freeze, tamped down by boots and hooves. A row of tools along the outer wall of the smaller barn, hung with the careful neatness of a man who knew where everything was and needed it to stay there. Clara was in the yard when she arrived, attempting something with a length of rope and a fence rail that Selene couldn't immediately identify. She looked up, registered Selene's presence, and went back to the rope. "What are you doing?" Selene asked. "Pa showed me how to make a snare. I'm practicing the knot." "Does it work?" "Not yet." Clara pulled at something, frowned, unraveled it. "It's supposed to look like this." She held up a piece of paper with a diagram drawn in pencil. Rough, but precise. The lines of someone who'd watched carefully and tried to reproduce what they saw. "But mine keeps coming out wrong on the second loop." Selene looked at the diagram, then at the rope. "May I?" Clara handed it over with the slight wariness of someone who wasn't sure if help was going to feel like help or like being corrected. Selene took the rope and tried the knot herself, slowly, following the diagram. It took her 2 attempts. "There," she said, holding it up. Clara examined it critically. "That's not quite right either. The second loop goes under, not over." "You're right." Selene handed it back. "Try it." Clara tried it. This time, the knot came out right. She held it up and looked at it with the particular satisfaction of something achieved through your own understanding rather than someone else's demonstration. "I thought you didn't do things like snares," Clara said. "I thought that was—" She stopped. "What?" "I thought that was men's things. That's what people say." "People say a lot of things," Selene said. "A knot is a knot. Rope doesn't care who's holding it." Clara looked at her, then looked at the knot in her hands. She didn't say anything, but something in her face shifted. The small, almost imperceptible adjustment of a girl who has just heard something that quietly rearranges something else. They went inside. The kitchen smelled like strong coffee and something that had been in the oven since early morning. Mrs. Dolan was at the counter rolling pastry with the focused energy of someone who found the activity personally satisfying, and she acknowledged Selene's arrival with a nod that had graduated, slightly, from the assessment of yesterday to something closer to acknowledgement. "Coffee's on," she said. "Thank you." "Noah's in the barn with his father. They'll be in at noon." She paused, rolling. "He asked about you this morning." "Noah?" "Both of them," Mrs. Dolan said, and returned to her pastry in a way that made clear the conversation was finished. Selene wrapped her hands around a mug and stood at the kitchen window looking out toward the barn. The snow had stopped. The sky was the particular pale, empty blue of post-storm Montana, clear all the way to the horizon, the mountains sharp against it, the white fields almost painful to look at directly. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they're indifferent to you. The land out here didn't care about any of them. Not about Elias Mercer's grief, not about Clara's rope knots, not about a school teacher from Poland who had come back a day after she said she'd think about it. She drank her coffee and thought about that, and found it strangely steadying. Elias and Noah came in from the barn at noon, as Mrs. Dolan had said, bringing cold air and the smell of hay and horses. Noah saw Selene and broke into the particular run of a child who wants to run, but is also trying not to look like he's running. A sort of fast walking that fooled no one. "You came back," he said. "I left my scarf." He looked at her neck, which did in fact have the scarf around it now. She'd found it on the peg and put it on immediately. His expression made clear he understood that the scarf was not the real reason, but that he was prepared to accept it as the official version. I showed Pa the rabbit on the tree, he said, pivoting. He still says it doesn't look like a rabbit. I said it looks like a burned tree, Elias said from the doorway, pulling off his coat. He looked at Selene. His expression was neutral in the way that faces are neutral when some effort has been applied. Glad the road wasn't too bad. The road was fine, she said. Garrett said there was ice on the lower curve. There was. He drove around it. They looked at each other for a moment with the slight, mutual awareness of two people who are having a conversation about one thing while aware they are both thinking about something else entirely. Well, he said. Good. He went to wash up. She helped Mrs. Dolan put lunch on the table. Lunch was where the real texture of the house revealed itself. Breakfast, she gathered, was usually quick and functional. People eating in sequence rather than together, the ranch's schedule pulling Elias out early. Supper the night before had been Christmas, with its particular formality. But lunch was the daily meal, the middle of the working day, and it had the shape of something long established. Noah ate too fast and then wanted more. Clara cut her food into small, precise pieces in a pattern that was probably unconscious. Elias ate steadily and without comment, occasionally answering a question from Noah with the brief competence she'd noticed the night before, the economy of a man who had learned to manage a conversation the way he managed a ranch, effectively without surplus. But there were things she noticed, watching them. The way Elias always put the bread closest to Noah's side of the table without making anything of it. The way Clara, when she reached for something, briefly checked her father's expression before taking it. A reflex, small and probably unnoticed, but the kind of habit that forms under particular conditions. The way Noah talked about his mother in present tense sometimes. Ma likes it when the barn cat sits on the fence, and then caught himself and went quiet for a half second before continuing, and no one at the table acknowledged it, which was either kindness or avoidance, and maybe both at once. The mother's name, she had gathered from Clara the day before, had been Ruth. Ruth Mercer. She did not press for more. After lunch, Noah pulled her outside to show her the tree with the rabbit-shaped burn. It was a 10-minute walk through the south field, which Noah spent largely describing, in great detail, the appearance of the tree as he remembered it from the moment he first noticed it in September, building expectations that the actual tree had some difficulty meeting. The burn was there. It was shaped like something. She could see how, if you were 8 and imaginative and standing at a particular angle, you might get rabbit. I see it, she said. His face lit up. Pa says I see things that aren't there. Your father's a practical man. What does practical mean? It means he trusts what he can measure. Noah thought about this, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the tree with the focused consideration he gave to most things that interested him. Is that bad? No, it's useful. It means he doesn't make mistakes that cost him. But he misses things? She looked at the 8-year-old standing in the snow next to a burned tree, asking questions that were more perceptive than he probably knew. Sometimes, she said carefully. Yes. Noah nodded as if this confirmed something. Then, he liked you reading last night. He didn't say so, but I could tell because he stayed in his chair the whole time. Usually after supper he goes and does things in the study. He didn't last night. She kept her voice even. That's good to know. I thought so, Noah said, with the confidence of a boy who believed he'd performed a useful service, and turned back toward the house. She followed him, watching her footprints appear in the snow beside his smaller ones, and tried to decide what to do with that information, and couldn't quite. The afternoon passed in the slow, accumulating way of days that have no particular agenda. She sat with Clara at the kitchen table and helped her work through a arithmetic problem she'd brought from school. Not something Selene had assigned, but something Clara had set herself. A column of figures related, Selene eventually understood, to calculating feed costs per head of cattle across different seasons. Clara had set up the problem herself, with reasonable logic and one systematic error she'd been making from the top that compounded as it went down. Here, Selene said, start again here, see what changes. Clara looked at the revised figures, then back at her own. I was dividing wrong. You were dividing right. You used the wrong number to divide by. Clara looked at this for a long moment. That's the same mistake twice if I don't understand why. Then let's make sure you understand why. They spent 20 minutes on it. When Clara got it right, she didn't celebrate. She just looked at the correct answer with a kind of grim satisfaction, wrote it in, and closed her notebook. Then she said, without looking up, Why aren't you married? Selene blinked. Excuse me? You're good at things, Clara said, as if this were simply a logical progression. People like you, you're not... She paused, searching. You're not frightening or strange or anything like that, so why aren't you? Clara... I'm not being rude, Clara said, in the tone of someone who is aware of the line and has checked whether they've crossed it. I'm just asking. You don't have to answer. Selene looked at the girl. Her careful posture, her direct eyes, the slight tightness around her mouth that was probably her mother's expression, and she probably didn't know it. I've never been in the right place at the right time, Selene said finally. Or if I was, I didn't know it. Clara considered this seriously. How would you know? If it was the right time? I'm not sure you always do, Selene said. I think sometimes you only know looking back. Clara seemed to find this unsatisfactory, which Selene understood. She found it unsatisfactory too. Pa didn't know, Clara said quietly. With Ma. He says he didn't understand that it mattered that much. Until she was gone. She said it simply, without drama, the way children sometimes relay terrible truths because they haven't learned yet to carry them more carefully. He told Maggie. Maggie told me. I don't think he knows I know. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside someone, Elias probably, was splitting wood. The regular crack of it carried through the window glass. You don't have to tell me this, Selene said. I know, Clara said. I wanted to. She opened her notebook again, signaling that the subject was closed. Can you check the next problem too? Selene checked the next problem. She was still at the table when Elias came in from outside, tracking snow across the floor in a way that would have earned Noah a word and somehow went unaddressed when Elias did it. He stopped when he saw her, registered Clara's presence with a look that assessed the situation in about 2 seconds. Still here, he said. You had a firewood problem. He looked at her. I had a firewood problem. 3 pieces left in the box. I noticed at lunch. I've been handling firewood since before you came to Montana, Miss Ashford. I imagine you have, she said pleasantly. Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, but in the vicinity of it. He took off his coat, hung it. Clara had gone back to her notebook with the focused attention of someone pretending very hard not to listen. He poured coffee, stood at the counter. He hadn't shaved that morning. She noticed this in the flat afternoon light, the rough line of his jaw, the weariness that sat in him with the permanence of something that had been there long enough to stop feeling like weariness and start feeling like just the shape of his face. I owe you an explanation, he said, not looking at her. For what? For why I invited you. He wrapped both hands around the mug. The children wanted it, that was true, but that wasn't... He stopped. I've watched you walk back to that store for 3 winters, he said. Every evening, through the window at the feed store when I came in Fridays. I didn't mean to, I just... He stopped again. Clara's pencil had gone very still. You looked, he said carefully, like someone who had given everything to a place and the place hadn't given anything back. The words arrived without warning, the way certain true things do. Not dramatic, just accurate, with the quiet impact of something that has been true for a long time and is only now being said aloud. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at her hands on the table. That's a very observant conclusion, she said, from a Friday window. I'm not unobservant, he said. I don't always do anything with it. But you did this time. He looked at her. I did this time, he said. Clara's pencil began moving again, very slowly. The afternoon faded into evening, and the evening found them at supper again, the 4 of them at the same table. And this time the stiffness of the night before was mostly gone. Not gone enough to be comfortable exactly, but gone enough for the conversation to find its own shape. Noah told a story about a horse named General, who had, according to Noah, developed a personal grudge against one particular fence post and periodically attempted to destroy it. He's run at it twice this month, Noah said. Pa says we have to move the post. I said we'll move it in spring, Elias said. General doesn't want to wait until spring. General is a horse and doesn't get a vote. Noah accepted this with the philosophical resignation of someone who disagreed but recognized the limits of his position. I still think the post did something to him, he said, to make him act like that. Like there's a reason. Horses don't hold grudges, Clara said. How do you know? Because they're horses. People said the same thing about pigs, and pigs definitely hold grudges. Mrs. Finch's pig, that's enough about the pig, Elias said, but not unkindly. After supper, Noah brought out a set of dominoes with 3 pieces missing, which turned out to be enough to play a version of the game that Noah had apparently invented himself, with rules he explained at length and then modified twice during a play when they produced outcomes he hadn't intended. Clara pointed this out. Noah said those weren't modifications, they were clarifications. Selene played the wrong tile deliberately on her third turn to see what would happen. And what happened was that Noah looked at her tile, looked at the board, looked back at her tile, and said with great seriousness, "I don't think you meant to do that." "I think I did," she said. "You're trying to see how the rules work." "Am I?" "That's what I'd do," he said, and picked up his tiles again. Elias watched from his chair without playing, which was clearly his usual position, present but outside the action, managing from a distance. He had a glass of something amber on the side table he'd been slowly working through, and he looked more relaxed than she'd seen him, which wasn't very relaxed but was measurably different from the straight-backed containment he wore in town. She caught him watching her with that expression again, the one she couldn't name, when she leaned over to help Noah count his score. She didn't acknowledge it, she helped with the count. Later, when the children had gone to bed, and Mrs. Dolan had retired and the fire was low, and the two of them were standing in the near dark of the front room with the particular quiet of a house that had settled down for the night, he said, "You're welcome to the spare room. The road will be worse in the dark." She had thought about this on the walk in from the south field, actually. Had weighed it and turned it over and arrived at no clear answer, because the honest answer was that she wanted to stay, and that was the part she was still learning to trust. "That's not appropriate," she said, "and you know it. Mrs. Dolan is here. Clara and Noah are here. There's nothing inappropriate about a spare room in a house full of people." Red Hollow would find something inappropriate about it regardless. Red Hollow, he said, is 5 miles away and currently under 4 inches of snow. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the steady patience of a man who had made a reasonable argument and was waiting to see if it landed. "I'll need to be back early," she said. "The stove." "I'll have Garrett drive you at first light." She looked at the dying fire, at the dark staircase, at the ordinary, imperfect room around them. The leaning bookshelf she'd noticed that morning, the curtain over the east window that had come half off its rod and been rehung slightly wrong, the framed photograph on the mantel she had carefully not looked at all evening. "All right," she said. He showed her the spare room, small, clean, cold enough that she could see her breath, with a quilt on the bed that was clearly old and clearly well made. He lit the lamp. He stood in the doorway for a moment in that way he had of being present without quite entering. "Selene," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. She wasn't sure he'd realized he was going to. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said, "for today." "I didn't do anything. You were here," he said simply. "That was—" He stopped. "That was enough." He left. She heard his footsteps move down the hall, the quiet click of a door. She stood in the cold room with the lamp throwing its small circle of light on the old quilt and the bare floorboards. And she thought about what he'd said. That was enough. And how long it had been since being somewhere, simply being present in a place, had been considered enough. She did not cry. She wasn't a crier, generally. But she sat on the edge of the bed for a moment longer than was necessary before she took off her boots. And she looked at the lamp flame and let herself feel, very briefly, and without much fanfare, the things she'd been keeping carefully at the edges of herself for 2 days. It was terrifying. It was also, she thought, pulling the old quilt around her in the cold and dark of the spare room in Elias Mercer's house, something she was going to have to stop running from. She lay down. The house settled around her, the small sounds of a sleeping structure, the wind picking up outside. Somewhere in the barn, the distant shift of horses. Noah's voice drifted through the wall for a moment, some fragment of a dream, and then went quiet. She closed her eyes. For the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, she fell asleep in a house that did not feel like someone else's. She was gone before the house fully woke. Garrett had the wagon ready at first light, as Elias had promised, and she came downstairs in the gray pre-dawn to find the kitchen empty, except for a cup of coffee someone had left on the counter, still hot, which meant someone had been up before her and had thought to do that and had then made themselves absent, which was a particular kind of consideration she didn't know what to do with. She drank it standing at the window. Outside, the snow had stopped and the world was very still and very white, and the mountains to the west were turning the faint pink of early morning. She washed the cup and left it where she'd found it. She did not see Elias before she left. She was not sure if she was relieved or disappointed, and she was not interested at 5:30 in the morning in the cold kitchen of someone else's house in examining that question too closely. The drive back to Red Hollow was quiet and bright, the snow catching the early light, and she sat in the wagon with her scarf pulled up and her thoughts moving in the same slow circles they'd been moving in since she'd walked through that front door 2 days ago. She had a classroom full of children waiting for her Monday morning. She had letters to write and papers to grade and a stove to convince into working. She had a life in Red Hollow that was functional and respectable and entirely, quietly insufficient. She had known that last part for years. She had simply, up until very recently, accepted it as the permanent condition of things. What she hadn't counted on was someone noticing. School resumed on the 27th, 3 days after Christmas, and the first thing Noah Mercer did when he walked through the schoolhouse door was put a folded piece of paper on her desk without saying anything and go directly to his seat. She waited until the other children were settled before she opened it. It was a drawing, pencil on paper, the lines uncertain in the way of a child who wants precision and doesn't yet have full control of his hand. A house with smoke from the chimney. 4 figures in front of it, sized differently, tall, medium, small, smaller. And above them, in Noah's block letter printing, Merry Christmas, Miss Ashford. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. She taught the morning lesson. During the noon break, she took the drawing out and looked at it again, and then put it away before anyone could ask her about it. Clara said nothing that day. She sat in the second row and did her work and did not look at Selene any differently than she looked at anything else, which is to say she looked with the contained, measuring attention she brought to all things. But as the children were filing out at the end of the day, she stopped at the door and turned. "Pa wants to know if you'd come Saturday," she said, "to help with the curtains." Selene looked at her. "The curtains? In the front room, the ones over the east window. They're hung wrong and he hasn't, Clara's jaw tightened slightly. He said he doesn't know the right way to hang them. Elias Mercer, who had been running a working ranch for over a decade, did not need help hanging curtains. They both knew this. The question was whether Selene was going to make an issue of it. "Saturday," she said. "Tell your father I'll come." Clara nodded, businesslike, and left. She came on Saturday with a tin of proper tea. She'd been saving, and a practical knowledge of curtain rods she had in fact acquired through necessity rather than any particular domestic inclination. Elias met her at the door with the expression of a man who understood that the curtains were not really about the curtains and had decided to maintain the fiction anyway, because it was the scaffolding the whole thing was hanging from. "The rod's bent," he said, as way of greeting. "I can see that from here. I tried straightening it. How'd that go?" "Worse," he admitted. She looked at the curtain, half hanging, the east window only partially covered, the afternoon light coming through at an odd angle and landing on the mantel in a way that seemed to specifically illuminate the framed photograph sitting there. She had been not looking at that photograph since Christmas Eve. She looked at it now. Ruth Mercer had been a handsome woman, dark-haired, serious in the way of formal photographs, but with something around the eyes that suggested the seriousness was situational. She was standing in front of the ranch house, the same porch, the same boards, in a summer dress with her hand shielding her eyes from the light, and she was looking slightly off to one side of the camera, like she'd seen something worth watching in the distance. Selene looked at the photograph for exactly as long as was honest, and then looked at the curtain rod. "Do you have pliers?" she asked. They fixed the curtain rod. This involved Elias holding one end while Selene worked the bent section with the pliers, which was fiddly and required more coordination than either of them had expected, and at one point required her to ask him to move his hand, and then their hands were momentarily in the same space before they weren't. Neither of them commented on this. The rod came out level enough. The curtain hung the way. Curtains were supposed to hang and covered the window evenly, and it was a minor domestic achievement that felt, unreasonably, like something larger. "Better," she said. He stepped back and looked at it. "Yes." After that, somehow, she stayed for the afternoon. She couldn't have said precisely how it happened. Only that Mrs. Dolan produced tea and Clara appeared with her arithmetic notebook, and Noah needed help with a word he'd been trying to spell for 2 days. And by the time she'd helped with all of that, it was past 3, and leaving felt more abrupt than staying. This was how it became a pattern. Not a formal arrangement, not a discussion that anyone had out loud. Just the slow accumulation of Saturdays that found her at the Mercer table. and then some Wednesdays when the afternoon was clear and the school day ended early, and twice, though she told herself each time it would not become a habit, Tuesday evenings that stretched past supper. Red Hollow noticed, because Red Hollow was a small town, and small towns notice most things and comment on some of them. Helen Marsh at the post office stopped asking after her health and started asking after those Mercer children with an interest that was warm but not entirely unloaded. Dora Finch, the seamstress, said nothing at all, which, from Dora, was a form of screaming. Selene did not address any of it. She went about her work. She taught her 31 students through January's brutal cold, through February's slightly less brutal cold, through the particular cabin fever restlessness that settled over a schoolroom in week 10 of winter, when the children had been indoors too long, and their patience had worn thin in ways they couldn't articulate, and therefore expressed through minor cruelties to each other and an inability to sit still. She handled it the way she always handled it, with the combination of structure and unexpected variation that kept a room from going entirely feral. She introduced a geography game. She let the older students teach the younger ones multiplication, which had the dual benefit of reinforcing the older students' knowledge and giving the younger ones a slightly different relationship to the information. She read aloud on Fridays for the last 30 minutes of the day, which produced the exact quality of stillness she needed at the end of a long week. 31 children in various states of exhaustion, leaning in just slightly, the room quiet except for her voice and the stove and the wind outside. Noah, on Friday afternoons, fell asleep approximately 70% of the time. She adjusted her reading volume accordingly. What was happening at the ranch was harder to name than what was happening at the school, because the school operated in a vocabulary she knew, and the ranch was still in a language she was learning. She learned it through accumulation, small things. The way the house had a logic to it that was entirely Elias's, the tools in their places, the schedule of the working day, the particular sequence he moved through in the mornings that she gathered from what she arrived to find done and what was still in progress. He was a man who planned ahead in practical ways and didn't plan at all in emotional ones, which was maybe the more honest description of most men she'd known. But in him it had a particular quality, not callousness, but a kind of trained blindness, the way someone can be very good at seeing what needs to be done and very bad at seeing what they need. The curtains had been up wrong for 3 years. She had figured this out without asking, which meant for 3 years he had walked past them every morning and every evening and seen them and done nothing. Because fixing them required standing at that window, looking at that wall with that photograph on the mantel and deciding, actively, to make the room look less like the room she had arranged. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Not his grief, which she understood and respected, but the shape it had taken, the way the house had been preserved, not exactly deliberately, but through a series of small failures to change things, until staying the same had become the same as love. As if disturbing anything would mean he had not loved her enough to keep it. It was the kind of logic that made sense in the dark and fell apart in the daylight, but the dark was where grief lived, and Elias Mercer had been living in the dark for 3 years. She understood it. She did not know what to do with it. What she did instead was the things that could be done. The curtain, the loose floorboard on the second step that she mentioned once, and that was fixed the following week without discussion. A recipe for the Christmas cake that Mrs. Dolan had been attempting. Ruth's recipe, which Clara produced from a small tin box in the kitchen drawer where her mother had kept cards written in a neat sloping hand, and which Selene worked through with Mrs. Dolan on a Saturday afternoon in February, adjusting the butter and resting the dough longer and finding, on the second attempt, something that made Clara go very still when she tasted it. "That's it," Clara said quietly. Mrs. Dolan looked at Selene. Selene looked at the cake. "Almost," she said, because it probably wasn't exactly, but close enough mattered. Clara wrapped a piece in cloth and put it aside without explanation. That evening, Selene saw her set it on the mantel next to the photograph. She didn't say anything, neither did anyone else. What changed in March was small and then suddenly wasn't. She had been helping Noah with his letters. He was 8 and could read adequately, but his writing was still the territory of a child who wanted to go faster than his hand could manage, producing letters that leaned in multiple directions and words that occasionally lost a syllable in transit. They were sitting at the kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon. Noah bent over his paper with the focused intensity he brought to things he was slightly struggling with when he said, without looking up, "Do you like my pa?" She kept her voice careful. "I like your family, Noah." "But do you like him specifically?" "Why do you ask?" He shrugged, the elaborate, shoulder-intensive shrug of a child who is trying to look casual. Clara says you do. She says she can tell by how you argue with him. Clara is 12. She's smart, though. She is, Selene agreed, which was true and therefore not something she could argue with. Noah looked up from his paper. His eyes were dark like his father's, but where Elias's eyes held things in, Noah's eyes were, she had always thought, a window left wide open. He laughs more, Noah said, when you're here, not big laughing, just, he made a small gesture with his pencil, something his hand did when words weren't quite doing the job. His face is different. She looked at the paper in front of him. The word he'd been trying to write was February, which was a genuinely difficult word that tripped up most adults the first time they tried to spell it quickly, and he'd gotten it right. Your spelling is improving, she said. You're changing the subject, he said. I am, she agreed. Now finish the line. I went back to his paper, but she saw the small compression of his mouth. Not frustrated, just calculating. The look of someone who had said what they'd meant to say and was prepared to wait for results. The results arrived that evening in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had stayed for supper. This happened, by now, without much ceremony. And after the children had gone up to do their evening reading, she and Elias were in the front room in the near-familiar quiet they'd developed over the weeks. The fire burning steadily. The curtains hanging straight. The photograph on the mantel where it had always been. She was going through the papers she'd brought in her bag. He was going over something from the ranch's accounts, a ledger open on his knee, and they were in the same room, not talking in the particular way of people who are comfortable enough not to need to. Then he closed the ledger. She looked up. I want to ask you something, he said. All right. He looked at the fire. The firelight did things to his face that the flat ranch daylight didn't, softened the lines around his eyes, made him look closer to whatever age he'd been before the last 3 years had settled into him. He was 40, she knew. He looked 40 and also sometimes considerably older, and occasionally, at moments like this one, just a person sitting in a room looking at a fire trying to say something honest. Do you think? He stopped. Tried again. When you come here, is it? He rubbed the back of his neck, which she had come to recognize as the motion he made when the direct route to something was blocked, and he was looking for another way in. Is it something you want, or is it something you do because it's needed? She set down her papers. What's the difference? She said. The difference is everything, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Why are you asking? He turned the ledger over in his hands. A habit, something physical to do while the thoughts were loading. Because I don't want to be a place that someone comes to out of... He stopped, started differently. You spend your whole life being useful to people, giving things to places that... He exhaled. I don't want to be another thing you serve, another place you warm without getting anything back. The room was very quiet. Elias, she said. It was the first time she'd used his name without prompting, and she felt him register it, a small stillness in him, almost imperceptible. I come here because I want to be here. Even knowing, he gestured vaguely, at the room, at the mantel, at all of it. Even knowing, she said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face, a complicated series of things she could see working through him, like weather changing. He opened his mouth, and she thought he was going to say something that would move things forward, something neither of them had said yet, but both of them had been standing near for weeks. What he said was, It's getting late. Garrett should drive you before the temperature drops. She looked at him. He looked at the fire. She picked up her papers and put them in her bag. She put on her coat. She didn't rush it, and she didn't draw it out. She said goodnight to Mrs. Dolan's closed door, and went to the front door, and there he was, opening it, standing aside. Selene, he said. She waited. I'm not... He stopped. His hand was on the door, and something in him had locked up. She could see it. The door he'd rusted over, the thing that hadn't moved in 3 years. She waited, and it was a real wait, the kind where you genuinely don't know which way it's going to go. He looked at the photograph on the mantel, then at her, then back at the door. Good night, he said. She walked out into the cold. She heard the door close behind her. She stood on the porch for a moment in the dark, her breath making clouds in the March air, and she felt, precisely and without drama, the particular pain of something that has almost happened and then hasn't. Not sharp, more like pressure, the kind of thing you put away and carry. She had been carrying things for a long time. She was good at it. Garrett was waiting with the wagon. She climbed up. They drove in silence through the dark fields, and she sat with her bag in her lap and looked at the sky, and thought about the fire in that room, and the ledger in his hands, and the way he'd said, "The difference is everything," like he was telling her something, and didn't understand yet that he was. She was still thinking about it 2 days later when Clara arrived at school 20 minutes before the other children, which was unusual. Clara's punctuality was reliable but not excessive, and she had never before arrived early enough to catch Selene alone at the stove. She came through the door and stood in the middle of the room with her coat on and her hands in her pockets, and the look on her face of someone who has made a decision on the way over and is now committed to it. "My father is an idiot," Clara said. Selene turned from the stove. "Good morning, Clara." "I'm serious. I can see that. What's happened?" Clara pulled out the chair nearest the stove and sat in it without being invited, which was a measure of how agitated she was. Clara Mercer did not take liberties. "He told Mrs. Dolan this morning that maybe it wasn't proper for you to be coming to the house so often, that people would talk, that he didn't want to make things difficult for you." Selene turned back to the stove. "He's been different since Thursday," Clara said. "Since you left. He goes quiet in that way he goes quiet, like he's decided something and he's just waiting to finish deciding it." "Clara." "He does this," Clara said, and her voice had lost its careful steadiness, something younger and more frightened underneath it. "He decides something hurts too much, and then he builds a wall around it. He did it with Ma. After she died, She stopped, breathed. "He doesn't talk about her. He doesn't look at anything that was hers, except the photograph. He just keeps going. He's good at keeping going. He's terrible at everything else." Selene turned around. Clara was sitting in the chair with her hands clenched in her lap, and her jaw was set in the exact line. Her father's jaw set when he was trying not to show something, and she was 12 years old and had been watching her father hold grief over himself like a shield for 3 years, and was now watching him prepare to do the same thing with whatever this was. "I know," Selene said quietly. "Then why do you let him?" "Because I can't make someone want something they're not ready to want," Selene said. "I know that's not what you want to hear, but some things can't be pushed. And if he's never ready?" It was the honest question, the one underneath all the others. Selene looked at this child, this careful, precise, frightened girl, and didn't give her the comfortable answer, because Clara would have known it was comfortable and would have trusted her less for it. "I don't know," she said. Clara looked at her for a long moment, then she looked at her hands. "Noah cried last night," she said. "He thought I was asleep. He does that sometimes. Waits until he thinks I'm asleep." She paused. "He said, I could hear him. He said I don't want her to stop coming." The classroom was very still. Outside, the first of the other children were audible on the road, their voices carrying thin and clear in the cold morning air. "He shouldn't have heard that," Clara said. "What Pa said to Mrs. Dolan, but Noah hears everything. He's always around corners when you don't expect him." Selene thought of Noah with his folded paper, his careful studies of things, his question, "His face is different when you're here." 8 years old and already cataloging what his father's happiness looked like, because it was rare enough to be worth tracking. She looked at the door. The other children would be coming in 2 minutes. "Go to your seat," she said. Clara stood. She had the slightly deflated look of someone who'd come expecting action and gotten patience instead, which wasn't what she'd wanted but might be what was needed. She went to her seat. Selene stoked the stove. The room was warming now, the old iron finally doing its job, and the sound of children at the door grew louder, and then the door swung open and the day's noise came in with them. Cold air and boot stomping, and 3 simultaneous conversations, and the particular chaos of 31 children arriving into a confined space. Noah came in near the back of the crowd. He didn't put a paper on her desk that morning. He went straight to his seat and sat down and looked at her with an expression she recognized, the one he wore when he was keeping something in with effort. She looked at him. She couldn't say anything, not here, not in front of everyone. She just gave him a small nod. He blinked, looked at his desk, looked back up. She turned to the board and began writing the morning's first problem, and the room settled into its working quiet, and she stood at the front of her classroom and felt the weight of everything that had been said and done and not done. And she kept her face steady and her voice even, and she taught. Because that was what she was good at, showing up to something difficult and doing the work anyway. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that the doing of it had already changed things beyond the point where anyone could go back to the way they'd been before. The house was already different. The children were already different. And Elias Mercer, 5 miles outside of town, was sitting at his kitchen table with his ledger untouched in front of him and the sound of a house that was quieter than it had been, feeling the exact outline of something he'd tried to wall off, and discovering that the wall, this time, was not going to hold. The week after Clara's early morning visit to the schoolhouse, Selene did not go to the ranch. She told herself this was practical. She had papers to grade, letters long overdue, a loose board in her floor above the dry goods store that had been snagging her boot heel for 2 months, and that she finally spent a Saturday afternoon dealing with herself badly, with a hammer she borrowed from Dora Finch and 3 nails she put in at the wrong angle before the 4th one held. The board stopped moving. The job was ugly but functional. She stood back and looked at it and thought that was probably a reasonable metaphor for something, and then decided she was too tired for metaphors and made herself supper. She did not go on Wednesday either. What she was doing, and she was honest enough with herself to name it without dressing it up, was waiting. Not punishing anyone, not making a point, just waiting. Because Elias Mercer had stood at his own front door and chosen distance over whatever the alternative was, and she had spent enough of her life closing gaps that other people created that she had made, somewhere in the past several years, a quiet private rule about it. She would not chase. She would be available, genuinely and without performance, but she would not pursue a man across the distance he had deliberately put between them. She had some dignity. Not infinite, but some. The school week moved at its usual pace. Noah Mercer watched her with the careful tracking attention of a child monitoring a situation he didn't fully understand and couldn't control, which was probably the most unsettling form of being watched she had experienced in a professional setting. He did his work. He didn't ask questions. The absence of questions from Noah was, she was learning, louder than the questions. Clara was quieter than usual, which for Clara meant she was nearly silent, doing her work with the focused precision she always brought to it, eating her noon lunch alone at the end of the bench, looking out the window at the snow with the expression of someone working through a problem that arithmetic could not solve. On Thursday, a letter arrived at the post office from Helena, from Maggie, Margaret Mercer, the eldest, the one who had gone to the city school. Helen Marsh handed it to Selene with the slight significant pause of someone who knew whose name was on the envelope and was restraining commentary. She delivered it to Clara after school. Clara looked at it, turned it over, looked at the handwriting on the front. "She writes to you?" Selene said. "Sometimes," Clara said. "She writes to Pa too, but she writes to me more. She says Pa's letters are like—" Clara thought about it. "She says reading one of Pa's letters is like reading a weather report." "That's unkind." "It's accurate," Clara said, and put the letter in her coat pocket. Then, "She asked about you in her last letter. She said Noah mentioned you in his letter to her." Selene kept her expression neutral. "That's nice. She said—" Clara paused, deciding something. "She said she was glad that there was someone. She worries about Pa." "Maggie doesn't need to worry about me," Selene said, and then heard how she'd answered, as if she were already something that fit inside the category Maggie was worrying about, and she stopped. Clara had heard it too. She looked at her with the 12-year-old perceptiveness that Selene had come to find both useful and thoroughly inconvenient. "She doesn't worry about you," Clara said carefully. "She worries about him. That's different." And then she said goodnight and walked out, leaving Selene standing in the cooling classroom with the fire burning down and the very clear sense that this family of imperfect, guarded, clear-eyed people was going to be the end of her composure if she wasn't careful. What broke the pattern was not Selene. It was the last Saturday of March, which arrived with a cold snap that hadn't been forecasted and drove the temperature down sharply overnight. She was in her rooms above the dry goods store, doing nothing in particular, reading the week-old paper, watching the snow that had started again around noon, thinking about the unanswered letters on her table, when she heard the knock at her outside door. She went to the window first. Below, in the street, a horse stood tied to the post in front of the store, its breath coming in white plumes, its back dusted with snow. Not the Mercer wagon, just a horse, saddled. She recognized the horse before she recognized, when she opened the door, the rider. Clara stood on the landing with snow in her hair, and her coat inadequately fastened and the expression of someone who had ridden 5 miles in deteriorating weather and was not going to be deterred by a flight of icy stairs. "Clara!" Selene pulled the door open fully. "Get inside, now." Clara came in and stood on the mat dripping, and Selene was already getting the kettle on before Clara had taken her coat off, because the child was cold down to her core. She could see it in the blue tinge at her lips and the way her hands moved stiffly. "Did you ride here alone?" Selene said. "Garrett would have told Pa." "Clara, I know," Clara said. "I know it was... I know, but I needed to talk to you, and I couldn't wait." "Sit." Selene pointed at the chair nearest the stove. "Coat off. I'll get a blanket." She got this blanket from the bed, wrapped it around the girl's shoulders, put the tea on. She didn't ask anything until Clara had both hands around a mug, and had stopped shaking visibly, because there were questions that had to wait for the body to be warm before the mind could deal with them. "All right," Selene said, sitting across from her. "What happened?" Clara looked at the mug. Her jaw was still set, but something in it had changed. The 12-year-old composure with the 7-year-old underneath it. "Pa said this morning that we probably shouldn't expect you to come to the ranch anymore, that he thought it was better, for everyone." She said the last two words with a flatness that made clear what she thought of them. Selene was quiet. "He said it like it was already decided. He didn't ask us. He just said it, and then he went out to the barn." Clara looked up. "Noah heard him." "Oh, Noah was around the corner," Clara said. "He's always around corners, and he..." She stopped. Her mouth pressed flat. "He came and found me in the kitchen, and he said Pa said you weren't coming anymore, and he started crying, and he couldn't stop." She said it with the slightly raw quality of someone who had held it together in the moment, and was now, in a warm room with tea, feeling the shape of it properly. "He kept saying, 'But why? But why?' And I didn't know what to tell him because I don't understand it either. I know what Pa is doing. I know he's scared. But Noah's 8. He doesn't understand why being scared makes you push people away." Selene looked at her hands around her own mug. "I should go back," Clara said, "before Pa notices I've gone, but I needed..." She stopped, swallowed. "I needed to tell you. Because if you don't know, you'll think he means it. And he does mean it, and also he doesn't. He means it the way he means everything he says too fast before he's thought it through." "You know your father well," Selene said. "I've had 3 years to watch him hurt himself," Clara said, with a bluntness that was not unkind but was very, very honest. She rode back before dark, despite Selene's offer of the spare room. "No," she said. "If she wasn't home by supper, Garrett would go looking for her and then Pa would know, and that was a different problem." Selene watched her go from the window, the horse picking its way carefully down the snow-muffled street, Clara's back straight even in the cold, and felt something move in her chest that was somewhere between admiration and heartbreak. She spent the evening in the chair by the window. She didn't read, she didn't grade papers. She sat and looked at the street below and thought about Elias Mercer standing in his barn, while his 8-year-old son cried in the kitchen, and she thought about Noah saying "but why" over and over, in a voice that Clara had tried to hold and couldn't, and she thought about the wall Elias had built, and the ways it kept failing him from the inside. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, enough. Not anger, not even frustration, quite. Just a quiet, firm decision, the kind that doesn't announce itself or ask for agreement. She had spent enough years accommodating the distances other people put up, serving in rooms she was never invited to stay in, warming spaces and then removing herself tidily when the warmth was no longer needed. She had made her quiet rule about not chasing, and she stood by it. But there was a difference between chasing a man and refusing to disappear simply because disappearing would be easier for him. She was not going to disappear. She arrived at Mercer Ranch the following morning on the public road stage that went as far as Miller's Crossing and walked the last mile herself in boots that were not designed for a mile of unplowed road. By the time she came over the rise and saw the ranch below, she had wet feet and a specific irritation that she intended to use productively. Garrett saw her from the yard and had the startled look of a young man who did not know what the correct response to this situation was, and was going to make himself very busy with something else until it resolved. She went to the front door and knocked. Mrs. Dolan opened it. They looked at each other. "He's in the barn," Mrs. Dolan said. "I'll wait inside," Selene said. Mrs. Dolan stepped back. Selene came in. She sat in the front room. The curtains hung straight. The photograph was on the mantel. The fire was going. The house sounded empty, in the way it did on mornings when the children were still upstairs. Muted footsteps. the distant sound of a drawer opening, the particular creak of the second step on the staircase. Noah came down first. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and stared at her. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Morning, Noah." His face went through several things in rapid sequence: relief, confusion, relief again. He came to the settee and sat next to her with the directness of someone who had decided not to make it complicated. "Pa said," he started. "I know what Pa said." He looked at his hands. "Are you staying?" "I came to talk to your father," she said. "We'll see." He nodded slowly, working through this. Then, "I don't want you to stop coming." "I know that too. I told Clara, and Clara said she'd go talk to you, and I said that was a terrible idea, and she went anyway," he said, with the look of someone who needs the record to reflect they had reservations. Then, "Did it help, Clara going?" "Yes," Selene said honestly. "It did." He nodded again, satisfied. "Clara's good at things like that, even when she doesn't ask permission first." Selene almost smiled. "She is." The barn door sounded, the specific weight and creak of it, and then footsteps on the porch, and then the front door opened and Elias came in with cold air and the smell of horses, and stopped dead when he saw her sitting on his settee. The two of them looked at each other. Noah stood up from the settee with the elaborately casual air of someone who had somewhere else to be and had just remembered it. "I'll go help Mrs. Dolan," he said, and disappeared through the kitchen door with an efficiency that suggested he'd been planning the exit. Elias was still standing in the doorway. "You walked from the road," he said. It wasn't a question. He could see the state of her boots. The stage only goes to Miller's Crossing. He didn't move. She could see him recalibrating. Whatever he'd been prepared for this morning, she was not it. "Clara came to see me yesterday," she said. His expression shifted. "She didn't. She rode alone in a snowstorm," Selene said, "because her 8-year-old brother heard what you said and couldn't stop crying." Silence. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel guilty," she said. "I'm telling you because you should know, because you talk about them, but I don't think you always hear what they're actually telling you." He came into the room then, slowly, and stood near the fireplace with his hands hanging at his sides in the particular posture of a man who has had something taken out from under him and hasn't found a new position yet. "What did Noah—" He stopped, started again. "How bad was he?" "Clara said he couldn't stop. She held him in the kitchen." She paused. "She's 12, Elias. She shouldn't have to hold her brother together because her father made a decision without asking what his children needed." He didn't defend it. She noticed that he didn't reach for an excuse or a redirection. He just stood there taking it with the look of someone who already knew and was hearing it said aloud for the first time. "I was trying to protect you," he said, and it came out quieter than she expected. "What people say—" "I'm not afraid of what people say," she said. "I've been the immigrant school teacher in a Montana frontier town for 7 years. I have been the subject of considerable commentary, and I am still standing." Something crossed his face, the almost of what might have been a rueful acknowledgement if he'd let it go that far. "I wasn't just protecting you," he said, and the honesty of it cost him something. She could hear it in the flatness of his voice. "I was—" He looked at the mantel, at the photograph, looked away. "When it started to feel real, when I started to think maybe this was—" He stopped again. "I don't know how to do this," he said, "without it feeling like like you're betraying her," Selene said. He looked at her. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." He looked at the photograph again. The morning light hit it differently than the evening fire did, flattened it a little, made it more clearly a photograph and less like a presence in the room. Ruth with her hand shading her eyes, looking at something in the distance. He had loved her. That was not a complicated thing, and Selene had never tried to make it one. She was practical, he said abruptly. Ruth. She didn't have much patience for people who knew what needed doing and didn't do it. He said it with the slightly hollow quality of a man quoting someone he couldn't ask anymore. She would have... He stopped. Selene waited. "She would have told me I was being an idiot," he said. "Probably," Selene said carefully. "Though I didn't know her." "No. But..." He turned. "Clara's like her in that way. That directness. It used to..." He rubbed the back of his neck. "It catches me off guard, looking at Clara and seeing that look. She came to get me," Selene said, "in a snowstorm, because she didn't want what you were doing to happen." He looked at the floor, then at her. There was something stripped about his face in this light, without the evening fire to give it softness. Just the plain, tired, undisguised face of a man who had been holding himself in a particular shape for 3 years and was feeling the shape crack. "You walked a mile in wet boots," he said. "I did." "To come here?" "Yes." "Why?" He said it without irony, without challenge, genuinely asking. She thought about giving him the careful answer, the one that left room on all sides. Then she thought about Clara riding 5 miles alone in the snow, and Noah crying in the kitchen saying, "But why?" And the quiet private rules she'd made about not chasing, and the difference between chasing and simply refusing to vanish. "Because Noah drew me a picture at Christmas," she said. 4 people in front of a house. And I have been trying to tell myself it was a drawing and nothing else, and I can't anymore." He was very still. "I'm not asking for promises," she said. "I'm not asking for declarations or certainty. I know what this is. I know what you're carrying. I'm not asking you to put it down." She paused. "I'm asking you not to push me out the door because it's the easier thing, because it has never once in your life been the right thing." The fire popped. Somewhere upstairs, a floor creaked. The curtains over the east window let in the flat winter light, and it fell across the room in a wide stripe that crossed between them like something drawn on the floor. He didn't move. Then the kitchen door opened and Mrs. Dolan appeared, which under normal circumstances would have been a minor domestic interruption and was currently the most precisely timed entrance Selene had ever witnessed in a residential setting. Mrs. Dolan looked at Elias, then at Selene, then at Elias again. "I've known you 16 years, she said to him, with the bluntness of a woman who had earned that currency and intended to spend it. "I held your children while your wife was in the ground. I have watched you manage everything in this house except yourself." She folded her hands in front of her apron. "You are standing in front of a woman who walked a mile through snow to get here, and you're looking at her like she's something you're not sure you're allowed to want." He opened his mouth. "I've got bread in the oven," she said, as if the matter was entirely settled, and went back through the door. Selene looked at him. His expression was a thing she didn't quite have a word for, something between mortified and arrived. Then, from the top of the stairs, Noah's voice, carrying down with the casual clarity of a child who has not fully mastered the relationship between distance and volume. "Is she staying for lunch?" Elias looked at the ceiling. "Noah!" Clara's voice, lower, urgent. "What? I'm just asking. Come back to the room." "But I want to know if Noah." A pause, retreating footsteps, a door closing with the pointed softness of someone trying to pretend they hadn't been listening from the top of the stairs for the past 5 minutes. Selene looked at Elias. Elias looked at the ceiling. Then slowly, his face did the thing it rarely did, the thing Noah had been tracking all winter with the careful attention of an 8-year-old monitoring something precious and rare. He laughed. Not loudly. Not long. Just a breath of real laughter, unprepared, unguarded, the kind that happens before you decide whether it's appropriate. He caught it and pressed his lips together, but it had already been there, already been real, and they both knew it. "You can stay for lunch," he said. She looked at him for a moment. This man with his rusted hinges and his honest face, and his 2 children on the other side of a door pretending very badly not to listen. "All right," she said. But they both understood it wasn't really about lunch. It was about the decision underneath lunch, the one he hadn't made yet in words, but had just made in every other way that mattered. She could hear it in his voice. He could see it in her face. The wall wasn't gone. The weight wasn't gone. None of the things that had made this hard were suddenly simple. But the door was open. She pulled off her wet boots and left them by the entrance the way she'd done that first Christmas Eve, and she went to the kitchen where Mrs. Dolan had bread in the oven and Noah was probably pressing his ear to the wrong side of a door somewhere, and she sat at the table that had become, over the winter, the nearest thing to a place she belonged. Elias came in behind her. He didn't say anything. He went to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her, and stood at the counter with his, and it was so ordinary and so not ordinary at the same time that she kept her hands around the cup and her eyes on the table and let it be both things at once. The stairs creaked. Then both children appeared in the kitchen doorway. Clara straight-backed and pretending she'd been on her way here anyway. Noah with his hair still flattened from sleep on one side and his good shirt on, buttoned wrong by 1 button. She looked at Noah's wrongly buttoned shirt. He looked at her looking at it. "I got dressed fast," he said with great dignity. "I can see that," she said. "Is your button wrong?" Clara said to him. "It's fine. It's wrong." It's fine, Clara. Let me fix it, Clara said, and stepped forward with the older sister authority she wore with such unconscious ease, and Noah submitted with the resignation of someone who had learned that this particular battle was never worth fighting, and Clara fixed the button with quick, practiced fingers while Noah stood still and looked at the ceiling. And Elias, at the counter, watched his children with his coffee cup in his hand and the look on his face that Noah had been cataloging all winter, the one that was different from all the other looks, the one that still had something in it that hurt, but also, underneath that, something else. Something that had been packed down too long under grief and fear and the bad habit of mistaking stillness for safety. Something that looked, if you watched it at the right angle, like a man coming back. The button got fixed. The bread came out of the oven. Lunch happened. These were small things, and Selene was aware, sitting at that table on that last Sunday of March, with wet boots by the door, and coffee going cold in her cup, that small things were exactly what the next few weeks would be made of. Not a single dramatic turn, not a moment where everything resolved cleanly and everyone knew where they stood. Just the accumulation of ordinary days, each one requiring a small decision to keep going rather than retreat, until the accumulation itself became something you could stand on. She understood this because she had lived long enough to know that the stories people told about love, the clean arcs, the decisive moments, the one conversation that changed everything, were mostly the edited version. The real version was slower and messier and involved a lot of mornings where you weren't sure and kept going anyway. April came in muddy and uncertain, the way Montana springs always did. A week of warmth that made you believe in things, then a week of cold that reminded you believing was premature, then warmth again that finally meant it. The snow came off the fields in stages, leaving the brown grass underneath with the flattened, exhausted look of something that had been pressed down for months and was just beginning to remember how to stand up. She came to the ranch on Saturdays. She stayed for supper. Sometimes she stayed until the road made Elias insist Garrett drive her, which happened more often as the evenings lengthened and the dark came later, and the excuse of dangerous travel was harder to make convincingly. He made it anyway. She accepted it without comment because she had learned, was still learning, the particular patience required by a man who moved toward things the way he moved through his mornings, steadily, in sequence, without skipping steps. I was different from before, though. She could feel it in the room. The thing that had shifted when she'd walked a mile in wet boots and said, "I'm not asking for promises." It had shifted something in him that couldn't fully shift back. He was still cautious. He still went quiet in ways that left her on the outside of something. But the door he kept trying to close on her no longer quite latched. He started asking her things. Not large things, small questions, at supper or after, that were the kind of questions you only ask someone you've decided to actually know. What she'd wanted to be before she became a teacher, whether she'd liked Chicago or only needed it. What she remembered about Poland, not the country or the politics, but the actual physical memory of it, the things the body keeps when the mind lets go. She answered him honestly, which was harder than it sounded. She was not used to being asked. She had spent so long as the person who held other people's answers that being on the receiving end of genuine curiosity required a kind of relearning, the unlearning of the instinct to deflect, to redirect, to make the conversation about the other person because that was safer and more familiar. "My mother had a garden," she told him one evening in early April. They were on the porch after supper, the first evening warm enough to sit outside just barely, with coats on. The sky over the mountains was the particular deep blue of the last 15 minutes before full dark. Onions, mostly, and some kind of flower I don't know the English word for. Yellow, very small. They came up every spring even when she didn't plant them. She said that was the point of perennials. They did the work of remembering so you didn't have to. I was quiet for a moment, sitting in the other chair with his coffee. Did she garden in Chicago? There wasn't a garden to have. She lived in 2 rooms above a butcher. Selene looked at the dark ridge of mountains. She didn't last long there. I don't think she knew how to be somewhere that didn't have a piece of ground she could tend. And you? She considered it. I think I made the children my garden, she said. Every September, new ones. Every June, you let them go. He looked at her in the near dark. That's a lonely kind of gardening. It is, she said. It's also the only kind I had. I didn't say anything to that. But a few minutes later, without particular ceremony, he moved his chair a few inches closer to hers. Not touching, just closer. And they sat there in the cold blue evening and watched the dark come in over the mountains. And it was not a declaration or a resolution, but it was real, and she held it the same way she held the other small things, carefully, without squeezing. Noah, meanwhile, had decided the situation was progressing too slowly and had taken personal responsibility for accelerating it, which manifested in a series of strategies of varying subtlety. He began requesting at supper that Selene tell stories, not read them, but tell them, from memory or invention, which meant she had to stay longer because stories took time. He developed a recurring series of questions about her rooms in Red Hollow. How cold was it? Was the stove reliable? Did she have a proper chair? That were transparently leading toward some conclusion he hadn't fully worked out yet, but was clearly building toward. He also, on 2 separate occasions, managed to leave her scarf at the ranch, which was so obviously intentional that even he seemed to realize the second time that the tactic had been sufficiently deployed. Clara managed him with the patience of someone who shared the goal but had concerns about the methods. You can't just keep taking her scarf, she told him, in a conversation Selene was not meant to overhear and completely heard through the kitchen window. It's not subtle. It works, Noah said. It doesn't work, she's kind enough not to say anything. That's the same as working. It is not the same. If the outcome is the same, Noah, what? Stop taking her scarf. A pause. Fine. What should I do instead? Nothing, Clara said. Let Pa handle it. A longer pause. Pa's very slow. I know. We could be old by the time Pa handles it. We're not going to be old. We could be medium old, like 15. Clara's voice had the sound of someone exercising real restraint. Go do your reading. Selene went back inside and pretended she'd been at the counter the whole time. What Elias was doing, in the slow, careful way he did things, was finding a language for something he hadn't spoken in a long time. She could see it. The same way you can see someone learning to use an injured hand again. The hesitation, the occasional overreach, the recalibration. I was figuring out how to be someone who wanted something for himself, how to hold the past without using it as the reason nothing new could happen. It wasn't linear. There were evenings when the distance came back, when he'd go quiet in a way that had a wall behind it, and she'd sit on her side of the wall and wait, and sometimes the wall came down before she left, and sometimes it didn't. Once, in late April, she arrived to find him in the front room standing at the mantel with the photograph in his hands, and she stopped in the doorway, and he looked at her over it, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then he put the photograph back, not face down, not in a drawer, just back in its place, the same place it had always been. But something in the gesture was different. The gesture of a man setting something down rather than a man keeping vigil over it. She went in and sat by the fire, and he came and sat across from her, and they talked about practical things. The south fence that needed work, a letter she'd gotten from the school board about next year's budget, and underneath the practical things the conversation was about. Something else entirely, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. May arrived. School would end in 3 weeks. She had known this was coming the way you always know the end of something is coming, abstractly, from a distance, until suddenly it isn't at a distance anymore, and the knowing becomes a different kind of knowing, immediate and specific. 31 students. The younger ones had learned their letters and their numbers and the shape of the larger world beyond Red Hollow. The older ones had done mathematics and geography, and read more than most of them would have chosen to on their own, and some of them had discovered, in that reluctant way, that they didn't actually hate reading. Noah could spell February without looking. He had also, over the winter, somehow become a child who sat still for 30 consecutive minutes, which was arguably the greater achievement. On the second-to-last Friday of the school year, she read to them as she always did, the last chapter of a novel she'd been reading aloud since March, a story about a family crossing the plains that had held even the most restless of her students for 2 months. When she finished, she closed the book, and the room was quiet in that particular way. The quiet of 31 children who have just arrived at an ending and haven't found their way back to ordinary yet. Then the bell rang and they moved, the ordinary noise came back, and one by one they filed out with their coats and their bags and their various accumulated papers, some of them saying goodbye. Most of them simply going because children don't always know they're at an ending, and that's not a failure, that's just childhood. Noah was last, He stood by the door with his bag over his shoulder and his coat on crooked, and he looked at her with his wide-open eyes. 3 more days, he said. 3 more days, she confirmed. Then what? She looked at him. Honest answer, she thought. He'd always responded better to those. I don't know yet, she said, but I don't think it means we stop, whatever we are. He considered this with great seriousness. What are we? She thought about this drawing at Christmas. 4 figures in front of a house. Merry Christmas, Miss Ashford. The wrongly buttoned shirt, fixed by Clara. The scarf retrieved and retrieved again. The porch in the early April dark. The chair moved 3 inches closer. I think we're figuring that out, she said. Does that bother you? No, he said, with the confidence of a child who has looked at a situation and decided where it's going regardless of the official information available. I think I already know. She almost asked him what he thought he knew. She stopped herself because some things were better left as Noah's private certainty for now, doing their work quietly, the way perennials came back every spring without being asked. He left. She stood in her empty classroom in the late afternoon light and looked at the 31 desks and the old atlas and the iron stove and the window that looked east toward the road to Mercer Ranch, and she thought about what she'd said to Noah. I don't think it means we stop, and realized she had said it without any of the careful hedging she usually brought to things she wanted. She had said it because she believed it. That was new enough to notice. She went home and wrote the long overdue letter to her cousin in Pennsylvania, which she'd been drafting in her head for months. She told her she was well. She told her she paused over the word, tried several, settled on staying. That Red Hollow, for all its cold and isolation and the 7 long years of feeling like a visitor in her own life, had become, in the past 5 months, something she didn't want to leave. She didn't explain everything. The letter was already long enough, but she sealed it and addressed it and set it out to go in the Morning Post. And she felt, doing that small thing, the satisfaction of a decision made not from desperation or necessity, but from actual, earned want. The last day of school was a Friday. She gave the younger children a simple task. Draw something you learned this year. And the older ones a short writing exercise she kept deliberately open. Write about a place that matters to you, not because she would grade them particularly, but because she had found, in 7 years, that ending the year with a question that had no wrong answer left the children with the sense that the point of learning was not arriving at answers, but learning to look at things. Noah drew the rabbit-shaped burn on the tree in the south field. She looked at it and felt something pull at her ribs. You're a good observer, she told him. Pa says I see things that aren't there, he said. Your pa said that in October, she said. I think he's revised his opinion. Noah grinned. The full, uncalculated grin of a child who has gotten exactly the answer he was hoping for and isn't pretending otherwise. Clara's essay was 3 pages long, written in her neat, slanted hand, about the ranch at night in winter, the way it looked from her bedroom window when the moon was on the snow and the barn was dark and the fields went back and back into the white distance. It was not sentimental. It was specific and unsentimental in the way Clara was specific and unsentimental, and it was, unexpectedly, one of the finest pieces of writing any student had produced in Selene's 7 years of teaching. She told Clara this directly, because Clara didn't need softening, she needed accuracy. Clara looked at the essay, then at her. Ma used to say that about the view from that window, she said. I wanted to write it down before I forgot exactly how she said it. Selene kept her voice steady. You didn't forget. Not yet, Clara said. The children left. The room emptied. The school year, her 7th in Red Hollow, ended the way all her school years ended, without fanfare in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, a door swinging shut on 31 small departures. She locked the schoolhouse and walked home. Elias was standing outside the dry goods store. She stopped on the street and looked at him. I was in his good vest, the one she'd seen on Christmas Eve, his hat in his hands. He looked like a man who had decided to be somewhere and then arrived there and was now working through the next part, which he hadn't quite scripted. School's out, he said, as of 20 minutes ago. He turned his hat in his hands. The same motion as the ledger, the physical thing to do while the thoughts got arranged. She waited, because she had gotten good at waiting for him, and because this time the waiting felt like it had a different quality to it. Not the waiting of someone holding their breath, but the waiting of someone who has already decided they're not going anywhere and is just giving him the room he needs to arrive. I've been thinking, he said, about what you said back in March. He looked up. That you weren't asking for promises. I remember. I've been thinking that maybe... He stopped, breathed. Maybe you should be. She looked at him. Asking for promises, he said, because I... He exhaled slowly, like a man releasing something he'd been holding at pressure. I've been trying to figure out how to do this without it meaning what it means. Telling myself I just needed more time. More time, more time. And I think what I've actually been doing is... He stopped again. His jaw moved. I've been waiting to stop loving her, he said quietly, thinking that was the precondition, that I had to be done. And I'm not. And I don't think I'm going to be, but I also know that... He looked at her directly, the same straight-on steadiness that had caught her in the post office back in December. She's gone, and I'm here, and you walked a mile in wet boots to tell me you weren't going to disappear. She said nothing. Let him finish. The children need... He stopped. No, he said, correcting himself out loud. That's not right. That's the version where it's about them and not about me. He started again. I want you to stay. I want... His voice was lower now, the way voices go when something is being said for the first time, and the saying of it is its own kind of work. I want to stop waking up and having to figure out what to do with the fact that you're not there. That's... He looked at his hat, back at her. That's where I am. Around them, Red Hollow moved in its ordinary Friday afternoon way. Dora Finch turning her sign in the window, a wagon going past with a load of spring supplies, two boys arguing about something on the far end of the street. Nobody paid them particular attention, or if they did, they were polite enough to keep moving. She thought about 7 winters. About every lit window she had walked past on her way home to 2 rooms and 2 chairs and a pine bough drying on the sill. About the morning she'd locked her classroom after her first September here, standing in the cold street and thinking, this is your life now, make something of it. She had made something of it. She had built 31 small gardens every year and let them go every June and called that enough because enough was what she had. She thought about what she'd told Elias about her mother's garden. They did the work of remembering so you didn't have to. She had been her own perennial, coming back every fall to the same schoolhouse, the same stove, the same window facing east. Returning to the same life not because it was what she wanted, but because returning was the thing she knew how to do. I've spent a long time, she said slowly, making myself useful in places I wasn't allowed to stay. He listened. I got very good at leaving before anyone had to ask me to, she said, and I told myself it was dignity, but I think some of it was just... She looked at the mountains over the roofline of Red Hollow. Fear. Of wanting something specific, because specific things can be specifically lost. He was very still. You're specific, she said. Clara and Noah are specific. She looked at him. That scares me. I want you to know that. I'm not standing here without fear. I know, he said. I don't expect... I know you don't, she said. I'm telling you anyway, because you were honest with me and it seems like the right thing to return. He looked at her for a long moment in the afternoon light on the main street of Red Hollow, Montana, in the spring of 1894, with his hat in his hands and the mountains behind him, and 31 children newly released to their summer, and everything still undone and unfinished and real. Stay, he said, not as a guest, not as someone who helps, as... He stopped, and then said the word plainly, without dressing it up or hedging it. Family. She felt it land. Not like something dramatic, like something that had been true for a while and was only now being named out loud. That's not a small word, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them looked away. I'll need to give notice to the school board, she said. Something moved in his face. Relief and something warmer underneath it. And I'll want my own room, she added. Until things are proper. Of course. Clara will need to be part of the conversation. So will Noah. They've been conducting their own campaign since January, he said, with the slight dryness of a man who had finally allowed himself to notice. I don't think you'll get much resistance. And Mrs. Dolan will tell me I was an idiot for taking this long and then go back to her bread, he said. She's already told me twice. She almost laughed. Not quite, but the almost was real, and he saw it, and his face did the thing it did rarely and was better for doing. She put out her hand. He looked at it. Then he took it. His hand large and rough and warm from the walk over, closing around hers on the main street of Red Hollow on a Friday afternoon in May, with absolutely everyone potentially watching and neither of them particularly caring. And they stood there for a moment, just that. Hands. The beginning of something that had been building since Christmas Eve, since a coffee cup left warm on a kitchen counter, since a child drew 4 figures in front of a house and printed Merry Christmas above them. Then with the unquestioned certainty of someone who already knew how the story went. She moved into the ranch in June, the same week the last of the snow left the upper pasture, and the fields went green for the first time since October. She brought her books, 2 boxes, more than she'd accumulated in 7 years anywhere else, and the bookshelf she'd built from planks and bricks that leaned to the left, which Elias looked at and said he'd fix, and she said she'd rather he didn't, because she'd built it herself, and she knew where everything was on it. He looked at it for a moment and let it alone, which she thought was a reasonable sign of things to come. She brought her iron kettle and her good scarf and the tin of cookies she always had in some form or another, and the worn copy of A Christmas Carol that had started all of this. In its way, that hour by the fire on Christmas Eve, Noah's weight against her arm, 31 children and a schoolhouse and a life that had been sufficient and was about to become something more. She did not bring the pine bough. That had been a different version of her, the version that decorated borrowed rooms for her own comfort and tried not to want anything she couldn't carry out the door. She had no use for that version now, or rather, she understood that version, respected the survival instinct underneath it, and was choosing something harder and more specific. Wanting things by name, staying somewhere that mattered, being, for the first time in a very long time, the person someone was waiting for. On the first morning, she woke in the spare room. Her room. It was her room now, small and cold in the early hour. But hers. She lay still for a moment and listened to the house. The particular sounds of it, the creak of Elias's boots on the boards downstairs, the distant mutter of the stove being coaxed awake, the thin, high voice of Noah saying something to Clara through a wall, Clara's lower response. The barn sounds, drifting up faintly. The birds starting up outside the window, first one, then several. She lay there in her room in the house that was becoming her home, and she listened to all of it, and she felt it in a way she couldn't have put into words to anyone who hadn't spent years living in rooms that made no sound when they were empty. The sound of a house that had been waiting to be a home again. She got up. She put on her boots. She went downstairs. Noah was at the table in his good shirt, which he'd buttoned correctly for once. He looked up when she came in. "You're here," he said. Not surprised. More like confirming a thing that had been coming for a long time and had finally, today, arrived on schedule. "I'm here," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his breakfast with the composure of a child who had seen it coming since December and was gracious enough not to say so. Elias was at the stove. He looked over his shoulder when she came in, and there was something in the look, ordinary and significant at once, the kind of look that exists between people who have made a real choice and are living in the first morning of it. "Coffee's on," he said. I know, she said. "I can smell it." She poured herself a cup. She stood at the window where she'd stood that first Christmas morning, looking out at the fields going back to the mountains, the sky pale and wide and clear. Clara came downstairs and sat at the table and opened her arithmetic notebook, because Clara Mercer's approach to significant mornings was apparently the same as her approach to all mornings. Work to be done. Mrs. Dolan arrived from her room, looked at the scene, and said nothing. She didn't need to. She tied on her apron and started breakfast with the brisk competence of a woman who had been waiting for this particular morning and was not going to make a fuss about it now that it had come. They ate breakfast together, all of them, at the same table, in the ordinary imperfect way of people who don't quite know each other's rhythms yet but are learning. Noah spilled his milk and Clara handed him a cloth before he'd finished apologizing. Elias passed the bread without being asked. Mrs. Dolan told a story about a goat she'd had in Ohio that seemed to have no particular point, but that everyone listened to anyway. It was not the version of this morning that existed in stories, not the clean, warm, cinematic version where everything resolved and glowed. The coffee was slightly bitter. The bread was yesterday's. The spare room still had a draft from the window she'd need to seal. Noah had somehow gotten butter on his elbow and couldn't figure out how, but it was real. Every imperfect, ordinary, irreplaceable inch of it. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage, the kind that isn't dramatic or sudden, but is instead the slow daily decision to stay in something difficult and uncertain, because the alternative is to go back to being safe and alone and only halfway alive. Selene had needed that courage for longer than she knew. So had Elias, in his different way. So had Clara, holding her father's household together from the age of 9. So had Noah, keeping track of his father's laughter with the patient dedication of a child who knows that some things need to be watched carefully or they disappear. None of them had been waiting for rescue. That was the thing that mattered. They had each been surviving in their own ways, doing what needed to be done, carrying what needed to be carried. The difference was not that someone had arrived to save them. The difference was that they had stopped carrying it alone. 4 people at a breakfast table in a ranch house in Montana in the spring of 1894. A widower who had forgotten how to want things. A schoolteacher who had forgotten she was allowed to. A 12-year-old who had been holding everything together with both hands. And an 8-year-old boy who had known how it would end since he drew 4 figures in pencil on a folded piece of paper and pressed it into his teacher's hand on a cold December morning. Not a perfect family. Not a replacement for what had been lost. Not a resolution of all the things that were still hard and still would be. Just 4 people who had, separately and then together, made the bravest choice available to anyone, to stop merely surviving the life in front of them and start actually living it. Outside, the fields were green, the mountains were still. The creek behind the south pasture, frozen solid in December, ran clear and cold and fast in the May light. The season had turned. So had they.